There are things one carries silently for a lifetime, secrets so powerful that speaking them aloud could shake the foundations of everything humanity believes to be sacred. Today, I will tell you one of those things, something I discovered in the final years of my life, something I never dared to publish, because I knew it could destroy what the Church has built for 2,000 years. Let me begin with a confession. I, Carl Gustav Jung, who dedicated my entire existence to the study of the human psyche, who explored the deepest recesses of the unconscious mind, who sought wisdom in alchemy, mysticism, and the symbols of ancient religions, once stumbled upon a truth that changed everything I thought I knew about Christianity. It was 1952. I was 77 years old and living on borrowed time after a heart attack had nearly taken my life 4 years earlier. My strength was fading, yet my curiosity remained fierce. I thought my days of discovery were behind me, until a letter arrived from one of my former patients, a Swiss diplomat stationed in Addis Ababa. His message was brief, but it froze my blood. "Dr. Jung," he wrote, "I have found texts here in Ethiopia suggesting that everything you've written about Christ and the archetype of the self might have a historical foundation, teachings that the Church has deliberately hidden. These manuscripts describe what Jesus truly taught after his resurrection, and believe me, Doctor, his words are more psychological, more transformative than anything Rome has ever allowed us to know." For weeks, I could not rest. I had long argued that Christ symbolized the self, the totality of the human psyche, and that the resurrection was not only a divine miracle, but a symbol of psychological rebirth. Still, I had often wondered, what if Jesus himself had taught such ideas? What if the original message of Christ had been one of inner transformation, a kind of spiritual psychology far too dangerous for institutional religion to preserve? That question ignited something in me. Despite my frail heart and my family's pleas not to travel, I knew I had to go. There was a quiet voice within, the voice I had come to recognize as the self itself, whispering that this journey was my destiny. So I went, from Zurich to Rome, from Rome to Cairo, and finally to the highlands of Ethiopia, a land older than history, where faith had never been fully conquered by Rome. As the plane descended over the mountains, I felt a strange certainty growing within me. This was not merely a geographical voyage, it was a descent into the oldest layers of the collective unconscious, into the origins of human spirituality itself. And there, among the dust and silence of forgotten monasteries, I would find the truth that had waited centuries to be rediscovered. The air in Addis Ababa was dry and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and distant incense. My host, Hans, the diplomat who had written to me, greeted me at the small airport with an excitement that felt almost feverish. He was thin, tanned by the Ethiopian sun, his eyes alight with something that bordered on revelation. "Dr. Jung," he said as he clasped my hand, "you are about to see something that will change everything you've ever written about Christ. What you have intuited all these years, it's here, preserved in the mountains." I remember how his voice trembled with conviction. There was no time for rest. Within hours he was already briefing me about the plan. He had secured, through the personal intervention of Emperor Haile Selassie, a rare and time-limited permission to enter one of Ethiopia's oldest and most secretive monasteries, Debre Libanos. The monks there, he told me, guarded manuscripts older than the Crusades, older perhaps than the very idea of the Church of Rome. That night, as the African sun sank behind the jagged peaks, painting the horizon in deep shades of crimson and gold, Hans spread before me his notes, pages filled with symbols, half-translations, and sketches of ancient illustrations. My hands trembled as I turned the papers. There were phrases I recognized immediately, words echoing the psychological truth I had spent my entire life pursuing. "If these texts are real," I whispered, "then Christ himself taught what we call the process of individuation. He spoke of the self, the union of opposites, 2 millennia before psychology was born." Hans nodded, his eyes glistening. "That's why I wrote to you. When I read them, I heard your voice, Doctor, but the words, they were his." We left before dawn the next morning. The journey to Debre Libanos took us through rough mountain roads, hours of bone-rattling travel, dust clouds trailing behind us like ghosts. Yet fatigue did not matter. With every kilometer, I felt as though I were moving deeper into something ancient, primal, not just a landscape, but the very memory of humanity. The monastery appeared at sunset, perched dramatically on the edge of a ravine, so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. Its stone walls, darkened by centuries of weather and prayer, rose like part of the mountain. Monks in white and black robes moved silently through the courtyards, their faces illuminated by flickering oil lamps. We were received by the abbot, Abba Paulos, a man whose presence seemed to bend time. His voice was low and resonant, his eyes full of both kindness and gravity. "Dr. Jung," he said in careful Italian, "I have read your works. You see Christ as the mirror of the soul, and that is why I will show you what few outsiders have ever seen. These texts are not mere theology, they are maps of the inner world, the map of the soul itself." He led me through torch-lit corridors carved into the rock until we entered a circular chamber. On its walls were painted scenes unlike any I had ever seen in Christian art. Christ surrounded by radiant light, descending into shadow, touching each of his disciples with beams of illumination. And there, at the center of the room, upon a low wooden table wrapped in linen, rested the manuscripts, the Metzfehan, the Book of Light. As Abba Paulos unwrapped the first volume, I realized my life's search had not been for knowledge, but for this very moment. The first time Abba Paulos began to translate the Metzfehan, I felt as though the air in that stone chamber had thickened, as if the very atmosphere resisted what was about to be revealed. His voice echoed softly, reverently, through the firelight. After I rose from among the dead, I gathered my disciples upon the Mount of Olives. They saw me and trembled, for my form had changed. I was no longer the man they had known. I had become the whole man, the anthropos. I froze. The anthropos, the primordial archetypal human, was the very symbol I had used in my writings to describe the total self. Yet here it was, spoken from the lips of Christ himself, centuries before the birth of analytical psychology. Abba Paulos continued translating, his eyes shining with reverence. "And I said to them, when I descended into death, I did not go to a place of punishment, but into the depths of myself. There I met the shadow, the fear, the doubt, the despair of every man. I embraced it until the darkness itself became part of the light." My hand shook as I wrote. This was the Nigrido, the black stage of alchemy, the descent into the unconscious, the confrontation with one's own abyss. Christ was describing the process of individuation, the same inner journey I had observed in countless patients who faced their own darkness and emerged renewed. He was not speaking of sin and salvation in the way the Church had taught. He was speaking of transformation, the death of the false self and the birth of the whole. Then came the passage that struck me like lightning. "Do not strive to destroy your darkness," the text said, "for it too was born of the Father. Unite what is divided within you. The lion and the lamb must lie together in peace, for both dwell in the same heart." This was the essence of the coincidentia oppositorum, the sacred marriage of opposites. Christ was not calling his followers to moral perfection, but to completeness. As Abba Paulos translated, I noticed a tear roll down his cheek. "You see," he said softly, "he was not merely the savior of men. He was their psychologist, their guide through the soul." At that moment, I understood why these texts had been hidden. If every man could discover the divine within, if each soul could face its own darkness and become whole without intermediaries, the foundation of religious authority would crumble. Hans and I stayed awake long after midnight, our candles burning low. "Can you see it, Hans?" I whispered. Christ was teaching the same truth the alchemists sought, that redemption is an inner process, that resurrection begins in the depths of the psyche. Hans nodded silently, as though words had become too fragile for what we had witnessed. And as dawn's first light entered through the narrow window, I felt something shift inside me. Not belief, but recognition. Christ was no longer a distant symbol of perfection. He was the mirror of the self, the voice of the human soul calling us to descend, to die, and to rise anew. The following day, we returned to the chamber. The torches flickered, casting golden ripples on the painted walls, and I could feel that what awaited us would reach even deeper into the mystery. Abba Paulos opened the next scroll with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from reverence. "Listen," he said, his voice low and steady, "to what the Master spoke on the 7th day after his resurrection." He began to translate. "Each man carries within him the woman, and each woman the man. For the image of God is not one, but two, the word and the breath, the fire and the water, the structure and the flow. Only when these two live in harmony within you will you reflect my Father's image in full." I leaned forward, hardly breathing. Here it was. The principle I had called anima and animus, articulated 2,000 years before psychology had language for it. The anima, the inner feminine of man. The animus, the inner masculine of woman. Christ spoke not of social roles, but of inner energies that needed to be united to form the complete human being. Then came a passage that made my heart tighten. Christ turned to Mary Magdalene and said, "Among you she has come closest to wholeness, for she has embraced her strength without losing her tenderness, her clarity without losing compassion." I saw Hans glance up, his brow furrowed. Even in that ancient world, these words would have been revolutionary. And yet, they rang with timeless truth. When Peter objected, the text continued. Christ replied, "Peter, your offense shows that you are not yet whole. For when you have embraced the woman within yourself, you will see her strength as your own." I felt the weight of those words settle deep within me. The masculine mind that dominates, the feminine soul that submits, both illusions, both fragments of the same divine totality. As we turned more pages, the language shifted toward something even grander. The description of what Christ called the eternal images within the soul. I realized immediately what they were. Archetypes. The timeless patterns that live in every human being. The father, the mother, the hero, the sage, the trickster, and above all, the self. One line burned itself into my mind. "These images existed before you were born and will remain after you die. They are the dreams of God within man." Abba Paulos looked at me and smiled faintly. "Now you see, Doctor, these are not myths of imagination. They are the bones of the soul itself." And then, the most astonishing revelation. Christ said, "I am the image of the whole, the anthropos, but do not worship me as apart from you. What I have realized, you too must realize. What I have united, you too must unite." It was overwhelming. In that small torchlit room, I understood what I had been seeking all my life, that Christ was not only the Redeemer of humanity, but the mirror of its deepest potential. As the final words of the day echoed in the stone chamber, I knew our journey was moving towards something even more dangerous, the reason these teachings had been buried for centuries. The next evening, the atmosphere inside the monastery changed. The air was thick, almost electric, as if the stones themselves anticipated the gravity of what we were about to hear. Abba Paulos warned us softly, "What follows is the part Rome feared most." Then he began to translate the 5th section of the Metzvehen, words that would shatter centuries of silence. "Listen," he read, "for I tell you what shall come after I ascend. Many will use my name to build empires, not souls. They will raise temples of marble, but forget the temple within. They will speak of my sacrifice as if it absolved them of their own transformation, and thus the living path will turn into dead doctrine." I felt a chill run through me. The prophecy was clear. Christ himself had foreseen the corruption of his own message. "They will preach of my blood," the text continued, "but deny the descent I have shown, the journey into one's own shadow. They will place kings and priests between the soul and God, claiming power over what is eternal." Hans looked at me, speechless. We both knew what this meant. The institution that had claimed to preserve Christ's truth had, in his own words, become its jailer. Then, unexpectedly, the text shifted. Christ began teaching methods, practical exercises, spiritual psychotechnologies, astonishingly similar to what I had later developed in analytical psychology. He said, "When you pray, do not ask, but descend. Close your eyes and go down. Beneath your thoughts, beneath your fears. There in the darkness I will meet you. It was the technique I had named active imagination, the conscious descent into the unconscious to encounter its living symbols. But here, centuries before me, Christ was describing it in perfect clarity. He spoke of the masks, calling them faces the soul wears for the world. He instructed his disciples, "Observe your mask, but do not become it. Behind every mask is another, until you find the face that does not change, the self." Abba Paulos paused, his voice trembling. "He even used the word for self," he said quietly, "in the old tongue, nefesh shlema, the complete soul." I sat motionless, the realization dawning like fire inside me. Christ had not simply taught morality, he had taught psychology. He had offered the blueprint for individuation, a way for every person to become whole through conscious descent, confrontation, and integration. And then came the warning: when the powerful learn of these things, they will hide them. They will burn the books that free the soul, but the words will not die. They will survive among the hidden, the outcast, and the forgotten until the time of awakening comes again. Silence fell between us. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains as though echoing the prophecy itself. I realized then that what we had uncovered was not merely knowledge. It was heresy in the eyes of history, a revelation too liberating for any institution to tolerate. As the last flame flickered in the lamp, Abba Paulos whispered, "Now you understand, Dr. Jung, why we guard these manuscripts with our lives. Truth can enlighten, but it can also burn." On the final day, the chamber seemed quieter than before, as if the air itself held its breath. Abba Paulos unrolled the last manuscript with great care, and for a moment he simply stared at it, as though he, too, felt the weight of what was written there. Then he began to read. "When I ascend, do not imagine that I go into the sky," Christ said. "The kingdom of the Father is not a place above, but a state within. My ascension is the rising of consciousness, the union of what was divided. And when you ascend likewise, you will know that I was never gone." The words resonated deep inside me. Ascension, not as miracle but as transformation. Not an escape from the world, but a realization of wholeness. Christ was describing the culmination of the individuation process, the self fully awakened, the human soul aligned with its divine origin. Abba Paulos continued, "And I give you 3 promises. First, that I will dwell within you as the spirit that guides from within, not from above. Second, that every darkness you face will be a gate to light. And third, that when the truth is buried by men it shall rise again, and for truth cannot die." I closed my eyes and felt something I could not name. It was not belief, not even awe, but recognition. It was as if the deepest part of my being answered back, "Yes, I have always known this." We sat in silence for a long time after the reading. The torches burned low. Outside, the evening wind whispered through the ancient stones of Debre Libanos, carrying the faint echo of centuries of prayer. I realized that I was witnessing not only the rediscovery of lost words, but the return of a forgotten consciousness. Before we departed, Abba Paulos spoke to me with quiet urgency. "Doctor, these teachings were never meant to create a church. They were meant to awaken a soul. Do not let them be turned into doctrine again." I nodded. I knew the danger. If I revealed everything I had found, I would be condemned by theologians, dismissed by scholars, perhaps even silenced by those who served power rather than truth. So I made my decision. I would protect the secret in plain sight. I would write of symbols, not scriptures, of the self, not the Christ of the altars, but the Christ of the psyche. When I left Ethiopia, I carried no relics, no copies of the manuscripts, only my notes and the quiet conviction that the path to salvation had always been within. Now, as I write these final words, I am an old man. The church still stands, magnificent yet hollow. But beneath its stones, in hearts that still listen, the forgotten gospel of transformation is awakening again. For Christ did not come to be worshipped. He came to be understood. He did not ask for blind faith. He asked us to descend, to face ourselves, to integrate light and shadow. and in doing so to rise as he rose. That I now know is the true resurrection, the inner ascension, the eternal return to wholeness.